Welcome to Cuz We're Nerds, the show that covers trends in comics, movies, video games, board games, and much more. Caleb's on assignment in Brooklyn, so this week I'm your host, Chris. Today we're discussing the rumor about Marvel buying DC. Where did this rumor come from? Would it ever really make sense as a move for Marvel and Disney? And has it ever been discussed before? Find out on this week's episode of Cuz We're Nerds. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Cuz We're Nerds. Just a bit of housekeeping up at the top here. We're moving the episode release date over to Saturdays instead of Fridays. I know we just changed the schedule on you from every other week to, no, I have this backwards, from every week to every other week. But now we're also shifting it from Friday to Saturday. This fits in a bit better for the C&C Power Hour production schedule. And also we have full-time jobs. And this will let us do a bit more work and give us a bit of extra time to develop the episodes. And in this episode in particular, let me do a bunch of research that I had fun doing and maybe got distracted by a little too much. Still, starting today, look forward to episodes every other week on Saturdays. All right, down to business. Was Marvel really about to buy DC? No. Boom, podcast time. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Cuz We're Nerds. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Okay, I'm not actually going to just end the episode there, but still, if you paid any attention to comic book news, you probably saw this somewhere over the course of the last couple of weeks. It was kind of everywhere at the end of February. But how did this rumor start? Well, on February 21st, 2020, Dan Didio left his role as DC Comics co-publisher. Reasons behind it still aren't officially released, but it's believed that it had to do with the upcoming 5G or Generation 5 reboot that had been planned at DC and talked about a little while over the past year or so. This reboot that Dan was heading up seemed to be centered around the aging up of the main DC characters. Think sort of like Batman Beyond, the early 2000s animated TV show where Bruce Wayne begrudgingly trained a younger Batman, except this time expanded to the entire DC universe. Now, this wasn't the first reboot that Dan had headed. When he and Jim Lee were made co-publishers back in 2010, they quickly saw the release of Flashpoint in 2011. So Flashpoint was a huge company-wide crossover that led to the New 52. The New 52 was a huge reboot that scrapped a bunch of older continuity in DC, including some things like Clark Kent being married to Lois Lane, or the Justice Society of America even existing. And they tried to, sort of take everything and put it into a cohesive narrative in a single universe. Eventually, that got expanded and relaunched as DC Rebirth in 2016, I want to say. Rebirth was like a weird attempt to capture everything that had happened before Flashpoint and take all the events that had happened after Flashpoint and sort of even them out, merge them into a singular timeline. Now, those reboots weren't failures. I mean, Rebirth was critically and commercially successful for DC, and New 52, when it came out, was pretty popular. It got me reading comics again, at least, and the creators that they hired on are still writing books, and I don't really see why this reboot led to Dan's departure. So it seems that because this has been coming at a time where DC Entertainment's new parent company, AT&T, has been investing heavily in the TV and the film side of things, as evidenced by the new upcoming Batman or Watchmen or the DC Universe streaming service. They sort of wanted those images or archetypes of the DC superheroes to stay the same in the comics. so that people could easily make the jump and find the comics a little bit less confusing when comics are already pretty confusing. So I kind of get it, you know, but um, there's also like this other component where it seems like Dan had a bit of a falling out with some of the creators at DC that either are publishing books now, or sorry, writing books now, or would be writing books for the fifth generation reboot. Um, and he just sort of really wanted to move ahead with the project, and ATT didn't. And so we're not sure if he left or if he was fired. It's still not exactly clear. I'm not sure if we'll ever hear the full story. Um, but where exactly does Marvel come in this particular story? Now, the exact rumor isn't will Marvel buy DC. That's just a short catchy headline. But uh, the idea going around was that AT&T is going to license out the publishing of DC Comics to Marvel. So Marvel would handle the comic book side of things, but AT&T would still have DC Entertainment handle the film, the television, the merchandise, the video games, everything else. Um, so now that you're caught up on what exactly was going on at the time that this rumor dropped, where did it come from? Well, it came from a YouTube channel with one anonymous source. The source or the channel, with its discretion, which I totally get, just sort of like talked about that this could happen, except within 24 hours, the news was everywhere between Bleeding Cool and comicbooknews.com. So name and shame isn't something that I'm here to do. The people that reported this, they have a source that they trusted. They reported what the source told them. Totally fine, totally above board. Uh, but what I really want to examine is why it seemed so plausible. And the first thing you think when someone tells you Marvel's buying DC. Okay, actually, I can't tell you the first thing that you think happens when when someone tells you that Marvel is buying DC, but I can tell you what I thought. Um, my initial reaction was something like, "Oh, okay, I could kind of see that, but why? Why could I see that? Why was I willing to accept that one of the biggest public or comic book publishers would just buy or license out the heroes from the other biggest comic book publisher?" So, in the last 10 years or so, Marvel's been the biggest name in mainstream media as far as comics are concerned. Okay, all right. So, brief aside, I'm going to quantify this as American comics because One Piece, one of the most popular mangas of all time, is on track to beat the lifetime sales of all Superman titles, which is absolutely insane considering that the comic has only been around for like 23 years. And that's counting, Action Comics, the comic that started superheroes back in the 1930s. It's already catching up on the lifetime sales of all Batman comics, which at the moment totals around 483 million issues, and One Piece has about 462 million volumes sold. That's a lot. So when I say comics in this particular video, I do specifically mean the American comic book industry. Regardless, the things that most people hear about are the multiple Marvel movie releases a year, and the like 5 movies that have come out since the Dark Knight trilogy ended. There haven't been a lot. There have been even less that are good. Um, no, you know what? I'm doing a disservice. 7 movies, right? I think. Anyway, still 7 movies compared to Marvel's 20 or whatever. That's a lot. For Marvel to be just constantly in the mind of the public, and so When someone says, "Oh, hey, Marvel's doing way better than DC. They might be able to buy them." People might not question it. Well, movies aren't everything, right? The CW side of the DC shows are still going strong, even though the flagship show of Arrow has ended. But Marvel is kind of getting back into the swing of things with the Disney Plus shows that are kind of, I believe, really existing to rival the DC universe streaming service shows. Um, we don't know if they'll actually be good. I hope that they are. They look really good, but that as is just another axis of the measurement of success. There's also merchandising, and let's not forget comic book sales. So the DC and Marvel comic book sales numbers have been pretty neck and neck over the past couple of years. Each of them selling around anywhere between 2 and 4 million individual comics each month, and these numbers are based off of the numbers from Diamond Distribution, I believe, which is the comic book company that distributes all the comics to all the comic book stores. And believe it or not, this isn't the first time the rumor has come around. It's been going on for years. It's just that it swamps between if it's going to be DC buying Marvel or Marvel buying DC. Not counting the rumor that DC is thinking about selling or completely shutting down DC Comics, which, as far as I can tell, has been repeatedly put out by one particular artist and not corroborated by anybody else in the industry. In 1984, Warner Brothers thought about closing DC and actually licensing out a trial set of the bigger DC superheroes over to Marvel. Marvel at the time thought that DC's poor financial state wasn't for mismanagement, but was because of poor characters. So they actually legitimately refused. So that's how far they got in the talks with this. But fast forward a couple of years later to the mid 90s after the comic book collectors bubble sort of burst and sales just dropped. Marvel was on the verge of bankruptcy. Something that we've talked about in a couple of different episodes, but Marvel was selling off pieces of intellectual property, and they almost were bought by DC at the time. It ended up not happening, but it was totally a possibility. Now, there's actually real precedent for one of these companies publishing the comic books of the other company. In 1957, before Marvel became Marvel and was still known as Atlas Comics, they had lost a distributor after American News Company, the nation's distributor that had practically a monopoly on the market, was found guilty by the Justice Department of restricting trade, as monopolies tend to do. Um, that company just completely shut down, liquidated everything. So Atlas didn't have anybody to distribute their books. Martin Goodman, the owner of Atlas, turned to National Comics, who wouldn't change their name to DC Comics until the mid 1970s, to distribute their comics, and they agreed. Except they sort of limited the number of titles that Atlas could publish from whatever they were publishing down to 8 books a month. So this lasted for a couple of years. So it's not entirely out of the question that this could happen. But the problem is not that it could happen and not that it's unlikely to happen, but the problem is that I had to take a non-zero amount of time to go and find this information. Whereas it's easier to just look at something and be like, "Oh, yeah, yeah, that seems about right." So, because this was a gut reaction that at the time seemed pretty reasonable, but has proven extremely unlikely, how did this get to multiple news sources and all over social media? Well, it comes down to a thing called circular reporting. So circular reporting can refer to one of two things. The first, which is not what happened, is when one publication s- publishes false information, a second publication picks up that false information, and the first publication and subsequent releases on the topic cite the second publication. So they're citing somebody that reported something that they had reported. Yeah, it's like the name says, it's circular. So it can get kind of a bit confusing. Now the second one is what really happened here, and has kind of happened with practically anything since the advent of social media. But it's where one source publishes false information or misleading information, and multiple publications report from that one source. Now, when somebody else, a day, an hour, a week, a month, a year later, goes back to find this topic, they see this bit of false information being reported by multiple places. So they have to kind of assume that these places did their due diligence and that it was verified. And when this false information coincides with like a related event, it gets thrown into the conversation of, hundreds of thousands of people and gets spread even further and even faster. Now, this can happen from anything like onion articles, which are satirical news posts that, if you're not aware they're a joke, sometimes can hit pretty close to home, or even user generated content like wiki pages or small blogs, indie news sites, YouTube videos, podcasts, things like that. Well, now, once those false stories are put up onto social media, they're often shared 70% more than the truth, or the actual reasoned take from whatever this particular piece of information is related to, and spread like 6 times faster than the actual information, especially false political news, which has been known to spread even faster than those numbers I just gave you. And people prefer information that confirms pre existing attitudes or ideas, such as Marvel is doing better than DC. And unfortunately, fact checking just isn't something that people can do with literally every piece of information that comes across our feeds over the course of a day. And it's just completely unreasonable. Now, you don't need to do it with everything. Like if you see a cute video of a dog, you don't need to go like, what is this dog up to? Do I need to believe that this dog did this cute thing? No, that's not what I mean. But you know, any sort of news or anything that elicits a reaction from you. So it's one of those things that the spread of misinformation and how to combat it isn't really within the scope of this episode, and maybe probably not even within the scope of this podcast. Uh, but if you take anything from this conversation, it's just to know that there are tons of ways that this information can be manipulated and portrayed to get a particular reaction or get shares, to get itself out there into the community so that more and more people see it and more and more people think it. Um, so really, just if you see something that makes you feel a particular way, or you just like make an assumption of like, oh, that seems right. Maybe it's worth taking a minute to look at it and be like, well, why do I think that it's right? And is it really? And if you can't answer those questions very quickly, maybe don't share it. Don't share that sort of information. Um, as for DC and the rumor that Marvel is going to buy them, or that AT&T is going to sell them, whichever rumor you're concerned with, Jim Lee, who was the co-publisher, but now that Dan is gone, is the publisher at DC, has already come out and debunked it. The 5G reboot has been shelved for an indefinite period of time, as far as we know. But from what Jim has been saying recently, DC is not going anywhere anytime soon. That said, you know who is possibly getting bought by Marvel? That's right, our good friend Taylor Poole. I don't actually know that this is a meta point on the whole false information thing. Whatever. Taylor did our theme music. You can check him out over at taylorpoolemusic.com. That's TaylorPoolemusic.com. This is probably the shortest episode of Cuz We're Nerds. These solo episodes, the more that I do them, the more tight they're probably going to get. And even though they're not quite as long or as varied as the discussion episodes, I do hope that you really, really enjoy them and have as much fun listening to them as I have making them. You can find me over at twitch.tv/C&C Power Hour. That's C, the letter N, C Power Hour, where my friends and I stream Magic the Gathering and video games throughout the week. You should also check out our website, cuzwerenerds.com. That's cuzwerenerds.com for past episodes and new releases. Thanks for listening to this episode of Cuz We're Nerds. Stay up to date with all the nerdy news and podcast drops by following us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also leave us comments and feedback at cuzwerenerds@gmail.com. That's cuzwerenerds@gmail.com. Finally, if you enjoy this podcast, we would love it if you could leave us a review on iTunes or tell your friends about us. And as always, stay nerdy.